morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm RJ Snell. I'm on the board of the Aquinas Institute and am the executive director of its intellectual side. I'm pleased to have this panel on diversity this morning. In his reflections on education, John Henry Newman suggested that a university that did not have a theology department was going to be a university soon in crisis, because theology was needed in order to orient questions towards some sort of ultimacy, and without that ultimacy, questions lacked their natural impetus and drive and dynamism. He also suggested that asking those questions would be done, even in the absence of a theology program, because other departments or disciplines would very naturally take over those questions because the questions needed to be asked. But other disciplines are not fit or appropriate, his argument is, to handle or to resolve those questions and mishandle the university. They would also fundamentally, his argument is, harm their own disciplinary integrity and autonomy by attempting to form the questions in ways that aren't proper to the discipline. This is Newman's theorem, and it's an interesting one. Our suggestion at the conference is not that theology provides all of the answers. This is not a conference which says, oh, there's an impasse in DEI conversations. Let's bring in the religious traditions to resolve and solve them. Instead, the insight is that the religious traditions have questions which expand the conversation, that the conversation is predictable at this point, and that the traditions which have been grappling with questions, including things like the one and the many, for thousands of years, can offer resources which can occasion thought. So we're attempting to occasion thought in a new and dynamic way rather than in the predictable fashions. So for instance, the theological traditions have to ask questions like, well, is there one God or many? Or is the one God a unity of diversity itself? What would that mean when we understand communion? Has God spoken only to these people or to all people? Are all people created in the image of God or not? Must all believe the same thing in order to attain their hopes? Right? These are the questions which are very natural to the theological traditions and which we think are good resources with which to begin. So we begin with the diversity. Our panel today, and we'll go in this order, includes Professor Charlie Camosy, who's Professor of Medical Humanities at Creighton University School of Medicine, Dr. Sebastian Milbank, who's a writer and executive editor of the Critic, which is a really fantastic and relatively new journal, and Professor Angel Parham, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia. Each of them will have about 15 minutes. We'll go one after the other, and then we'll take questions at the end rather than questions after each presenter. So with that, Charlie.
Thanks, RJ. Good morning. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm delighted to be part of this event and on this panel. I have to wonder, though, given the events coming up here in a few days, if it was chosen in proximity to those events or if it was just a happy accident. Obviously, we have an election coming up here. And just briefly adding to what Brandon said about new developments, I think that particular context also suggests something seems to be shifting here as well. I won't be focusing my remarks on this, but just here at the outset, I wanted to just flag that the Democratic candidate for president, when being asked about LGBTQ plus matters, seems to just be saying, I'm going to follow the law, right? You probably noticed that in the last few weeks especially. I saw this week a USA Today poll which suggested that Trump is likely to outright win Hispanics or Latinos in this election. Though that USA Today poll has a plus or minus 9 for for his margin of error, so who knows? At any rate, it seems clear that when it comes to DEI in our national political discourse, we're not in Kansas anymore, and that really does provide some hope, I think, for what you just outlined. I want to speak primarily about a Christian understanding of diversity, especially, but not only in an academic environment, and in particular as a Catholic moral theologian in this regard. And I'd like to begin by naming a couple of things that are in the background here, at least for me, and I suspect for several of you, especially given just how dominant the secular models of diversity are in academia right now, despite this very real opening. And I want to come back to some of the implications of this dominance at the end of my remarks. Here's a central idea. The commitment to diversity only makes sense in the context of a more foundational commitment to unity. The unity gives an explanation for the diversity. It tells it what it's for. It's good to have diversity in a basketball team, for instance, but not diversity for diversity's sake. It's good to have big guys who can rebound and block shots, smaller, quicker guys who can shoot and handle the ball. It's, of course, bad to have guys that don't have poor hand-eye coordination. But when diversity is invoked in a secular academic context, at least outside of DEI, which I think makes DEI interesting, the fact that unity is required to make sense of it is often explicitly denied or acknowledged only obliquely at the margins, like when someone says, well, I guess we got to exclude Holocaust deniers or something. But for Trinity-worshiping Christians, people who are many parts finding our unity in the body of Christ, we should be more ready than most to say there needs to be a substantial check on diversity by a commitment to unity. We should not hide it, we should not grudgingly admit it, or speak only about it when pushed to the extremes. We can and should be clear and confident about it, especially since there's really no way of escaping it. I love this recent tweet from Philip D. Bunn, who said, quote, I recall a conversation with my undergrad college president where I asked how he felt in terms of academic freedom going from an Ivy to a school with a rigid statement of faith. His response was, quote, every school has a statement of faith, some just write them down, end quote. But the problem that has existed for some time now in secular higher education is that their commitment to diversity is either genuinely unaware of its substantial and prior commitment to unity, or they're being disingenuous or playing games about what a term like diversity is being used to affect, especially as a weapon at the service of advancing a particular unified agenda. A diversity hire, for instance, in the vast majority of secular academic contexts, is actually something used at the service of establishing and even enforcing a kind of unity, without it ever really acknowledging that this is what's going on, or very rarely acknowledging this is what's going on. In previous contexts of mine, I've seen this unfold in real time with discussions, for instance, about a debate regarding a hire we were going to make. Should it be in systematic theology, Christology, or should it be in Buddhism? And the folks who were on the side of the Buddhist hire said, well, we got all these Chinese students, we got to serve our diverse student body. Nobody even wondered or asked the Chinese students if this is in fact what they wanted. But when pressed, my colleagues admitted that even if the Chinese students didn't want this, we need to hire for Buddhism anyway. And if you push them even further, maybe after a few drinks, they would say this is because we need to move more towards a religious studies model rather than a theology model. And it's something that they've actually been successful in pushing towards this. I'd also note that the secular academy sometimes invokes religion or religious ideas as part of a commitment to diversity, but again, it's also the unity that is running the show at the end of the day. Happy to welcome religious voices when they're having the right views on climate change, welcoming migrants, racial justice, but not so much when they hold Pope Francis's views on, say, abortion or gender ideology. Finish these preliminaries by talking about my own field of bioethics. Lots of talk about DEI and diversity in bioethics these days. Lots of noises about racial justice and centering black voices. But at the same time, lots of activism for physician-assisted suicide and end-of-life issues, especially you've probably seen the articles about how to die like a doctor, which basically means dying very quickly. The only problem with that, if you were centering black voices in those discussions, you come to very different conclusions about end-of-life matters and physician-assisted killing. One really interesting anecdote is here in New Jersey, which has had physician-assisted killing, I think, for 4 years now. Is it 2019? The first black person availed themselves of a physician-assisted suicide in New Jersey last year. It is an overwhelmingly white-centered practice and a white and privilege-centered practice. These tend not to get read through communities that have already made a commitment, a unified commitment along a different type of trajectory, and the unity is what's actually doing the work. Christians have the advantage of being able to avoid these kinds of this kind of game playing and be forthright about our commitments and how diversity is related to those commitments. And as Brandon has noted, the fact that DEI has been so open about underlying unity actually provides, again, a very interesting opportunity for us, at least in principle, to do this. I say at least in principle because many Christian contexts that I know of, we end up playing these games or a similar kind of game anyway. But again, a big part of my remarks is to ask us to stop doing that. Instead of playing those games, we should explicitly embrace unity in our diversity, knowing that we are united as a church not in spite of our diversity, but because of it. or if that's too dramatic, at least understanding our diversity to be a feature of our particular unity and not a bug. The very notion of relationship, of course, requires difference. We are many parts baptized into the one body of Christ. This makes us genuine brothers and sisters, real family. Of course, this gives us questions to ask about the academic project. What about academic freedom, disagreement? All families, of course, have real, substantial, and even painful disagreements, but grounded families rest assured that they remain a family throughout it all. What unites us is stronger than even our worst arguments. Our foundational love does not waver, and we are willing to suffer with our family members through bad times at the service of that love. A willingness to suffer with and for family members in the church is essential for our unity, and that it's a unity that Christ, of course, prays for his church, especially in the Garden of Gethsemane when that was about to be tested in the worst way possible. And that should also be true, I'd say, in an academic context. Part of what this means is that Christians must conscientiously refuse to focus on the boxable and dismissible caricatures which do violence to the full reality of our unity as brothers and sisters in Christ. Yes, it is certainly part of who we are as Homo sapiens to categorize others, to put them in boxes. It's evolutionary part of who we are, all that stuff. But when we focus on the full reality of our brothers and sisters in Christ, we have a commitment, again, to the relationship of family over time that balances the unity and diversity, and often through the grace of God is revealed to be real. This is not just sort of fluff that I'm offering you. Peter and Paul, as you know, went at it really hard when the fishermen came to Antioch. Scripture scholars disagree about the immediate results of the showdown, but we now celebrate Peter and Paul, at least in my church, on the same feast day as foundations of the pillars of the church. This is a beautiful part of how God works through the church to attain unity and diversity. Here's another example. It no doubt made Richard McBrien and Archbishop Lefebvre turn over in their graves, but it was so beautifully Catholic for Pope Francis to canonize both John the 23rd and John Paul II on the same day. Thinking this way now may seem problematic at this moment in the church. After all, as one friend who commented on my book, Manuscript One Church, noted that it was coming out on the eve of what might be a formal schism in Germany, so we got our problems here. But thinking about history, and again, how the grace of God works in the church over time, we need to be patient. We need to take the long view, and this should give us confidence that the goal of unity and diversity can be achieved. How does this happen? How does God's grace break into these situations and produce unity and diversity? My view is that it isn't through some completely mysterious and unexplainable magical power, but rather by something, again, that over time Christians effect by conforming their lives to the love of Christ. We hear things like the dignity of the human person as the divine image bearer must be our starting point so often that in Catholic circles, at least, it can become a cliche. We may zoom right past it without thinking about it very much. Sometimes we fail to think about the dignity of those with whom we are having difficult conversations, even when the disagreement is over what the dignity of the human person means or demands. But here's an uncomfortable truth, and it's especially important right now, I think, especially in the next few weeks and the aftermath. It can be extremely difficult to keep the inherent dignity of the person with whom we profoundly disagree in the front of our minds. But we need to. Fear and anger can blind us to our own biases and cut us off from real exchange with someone else. And there may be, in fact, good reasons to be profoundly angry. And this should be fully honored, while at the same time acknowledging that the fundamental reality of the person in front of you is the starting point for any serious exchange. Especially, I don't need to say it, it's become a cliche as well, but on social media, it's also very much the current structures of our secular academy where this happens. Our first reaction is to disparage, attack, define ourselves by opposition. This is when we ought to be demonstrating respect and even reverence for the shared humanity of our perceived opponents. And one way to resist the world's practices here is to be super intentional about Christ's command to genuinely pray for them. It can be extremely lucrative, of course, to own the libs or the cons, and it feels good to get the high fives and bro love from your side when you do so, whether that's online, at a table of a hotel bar, or academic conference. But it should go without saying that the very thing that's implied even in metaphorically owning someone else in this sense does not start with their dignity as a fellow image bearer, created in the image and likeness of God. And it almost never arrives at a mutual sense of dignity arising from gospel-centered love. But even when we manage to think this way, challenges and disagreements do not magically disappear, far from it. Indeed, in some ways, the disagreements become more complex. The fact that familiarity breeds contempt is one reason that there are so many challenges in family life, of course, and this is certainly true with our fellow Christians and Catholic families. We may feel anger or even rage that makes it difficult to imagine how an exchange could even go. Or we may not want to validate someone who holds views we abhor by engaging with them, platforming them, give them legitimacy. But again, they are dignified in the same way that our side is, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. They are dignified in the most profound way possible. They are bearers of the divine image and temples of the Holy Spirit. I'm aware of the time here, so I won't go into too much detail, but I'll just briefly name some other things that I think are helpful here. Embracing Jesus forsaken on the cross by genuinely listening to others in humility, especially when it's very, very difficult to do so. Mapping out and paying close attention to the power dynamics. Leading with what we're for rather than what we're against. Intentionally resisting and even deconstructing artificial antagonistic binaries. I think that's just ridiculously important. And always seeking to find significant common ground across difference, especially in the spirit of encounter. But even if we do those things, there's still disagreement, still profound disagreement. Then what? I have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to try to get through this. First of all, let's not be surprised. What I've just outlined can help us steer clear of certain classic and even debilitating challenges, and that's certainly not nothing. However, we are by no means able to avoid all the disagreements, far from it. Indeed, in some ways, what I've just outlined constitutes the conditions for the possibility of having disagreement at all. Note that humble disagreement after listening does not require us to stop trying to be persuasive, again, far from it. If a brother or sister in Christ is in error or has overlooked something that is hurting them, then trying to persuade them of this is in fact a loving thing to do. In some ways, only family members have the true freedom to do this in a way that matters. Let me just go ahead a little bit forward here. These kind of moves will not satisfy everyone, of course. That's what it means to be part of a universal church, a universal family, which tries to balance unity and diversity. I want to close with something my friend Jeff Moreau, who's also a theologian, offered in the context of thinking about this in a familial context. He said, quote, "The Catholic Church, for everything else that it is also a very large family. It is also clearly more than that, but is also that. I have 7 children, which no longer seems to me to be very large. But what living as a father and husband in a family of 9 has taught me is that not everyone always agrees or understands the decisions that are being made. Recently, as in a few weeks ago, our family moved to a new home in a new town. That was a decision my wife and I made for the good of our family. Was it the right decision to make? I don't have absolute certitude that it was. But as the parents of the family, we have the authority to make such decisions even when it upsets some of our children. One child in particular made comments like, 'But it's not the best decision for me. You never make the best decision for me.' This child may be correct, at least with the first part of that comment. But as parents of more than one child, we can't always make decisions that affect the entire family based on one child's needs. We have to make the best decisions as we can for the good of our family." Jeff said this in the context of his children rebelling, and in doing so in ways that, while regrettable, he nevertheless found understandable. This is a story which is instructive for our broader family on multiple levels. For those who bear the burden of authority, Jeff's story demonstrates the need to allow one's children to rebel and offer the reasons for why they disagree. The story is also instructive for those of us who are bound by this authority. It means that at times, decisions will be made by our pastoral leaders which, while not in our own best interests, are nevertheless in the best interests of the family broadly considered. That is, for maintaining unity in legitimate diversity. Let me finish by asking one way too big and provocative question, but one that will again bring us back to the explicit focus on the secular academy. Can what I've been suggesting here actually be done in the context of contemporary Western academia, with its competing ideologies and assumptions? The Middle Ages saw academic theology migrate from the monastery to the university, but the contemporary university obviously bears little resemblance to those institutions. We should be aware of presentism bias, and history shows us then that institutions can be reformed. But I wonder if the current institutions that exist seem antithetical to what I'm proposing here. Do we need to move into a different understanding of these institutions? And this will be my final remark. Catholic colleges and universities that are doing the best right now, especially relative to the size of their endowment, are those who are clear up front and focused on the priority of a unified vision of the good in relation to their commitments to diversity. And I think there's an important lesson to be learned there. Thank you.
Laying my cards on the table, I'm rather more of a DEI skeptic. But I am going to try and move us beyond the impasse by, I believe, looking at how some of the problems of DEI are indicative of a deeper confrontation between a liberal and a Christian theory of justice. DEI, or EDI as it is known in England, is a concept that belongs, unquestionably, to the corporate world. Like any concept that is best known by its acronym, it is instantly demoralizing. It renders questions that seem to start out as matters of basic fairness into the same grim tonality as ROI, KPI, IPO, SME, GDP, or GNP. Indeed, whether it is DEI, POC, CRT, or LGBT, the language of supposed political radicalism has become, by some mysterious alchemy, transmuted into the banal babble of the boardroom. I raise all this not in order to rehearse all the rather boring posturing of cultural critiques, but because I believe language tells us something. We can see, first of all, that this is a machine language, compressed and encoded, designed to be typed, texted, and transcribed, swiftly and efficiently. It's also intentionally obscurantist and occult, intended to exclude the uninitiated and catch out the unprepared. It disorients and disarms. It is a language of power, engineered to overawe the individual and crush independent thought. It is not the language of ordinary men and women, and it's certainly not the language of the oppressed or the marginalized. Modern institutions, even when supposedly putting themselves into the service of society and its weakest members, somehow contrive to render everything into symbolism of administrative authority. DEI has not served to strengthen the hand of the worker, but has instead opened up a previously sacrosanct area of her life, her thoughts, her conscience, her very identity, and made it a matter to be regulated by her employer. I find myself recalling, in this world in which minimum wage Starbucks employees can be forced to interrogate their white privilege, a scene in Charles Dickens' Bleak House. Esfer, the protagonist, and her friend Ada have joined Mrs. Pardigal, who is engaged in a particularly popular Victorian pastime, visiting the homes of the poor to express philanthropic concern. Mrs. Pardigal, armed with a Bible, strides into the home of an impoverished brickmaker and his family and sets out to correct their slovenly ways. Mrs. Pardigal, who had been regarding him through her spectacles with a forcible composure, calculated, I could not help thinking, to increase his antagonism, pulled out the good book as it were a constable's staff and took the whole family into custody. I mean into religious custody, of course, but she really did it as if she were an inexecrable moral policeman carrying them all off to a station house. Mrs. Pardigal leaves, but Esfer and Ada remain. They're concerned for the man's wife, who has a black eye and a sickly infant on her lap. The baby, it turns out, is dead. Ada weeps, and the mother joins her. Such compassion, such gentleness, as that which she bent down weeping and put her hand upon the mother's, might have softened any mother's heart that ever beat. The woman at first gazed at her in astonishment and then burst into tears. We see in these two attitudes the difference between human compassion and an inhuman, synthetic charity. Pardigal, who performs her charity wholesale, evoking the commercial language of the day, sets what Esfer describes as an iron wall between herself and the family. The ideas she communicates, like our modern-day promises of equality and inclusion, are not bad in themselves, but here they're delivered like a kind of violence. In stark contrast, Esfer and Ada embody not the dead letter of biblical sermonizing, but the living spirit of its words. Instead of a lecture, they offer tears and touch in the face of tragedy. Scripture is communicated as a whisper of hope in the ear of a grieving mother. In this literary example, I think we begin to see a model of what real fairness and a human response to inequality and oppression might look like. There is a term that reflects it, often maligned and parodied on the right, and frequently misused by the progressive left: social justice. Justice in its classical sense is defined, very simply, as giving each man his due, and is oriented towards the creation of a society ordered around the common good. It is this latter aspect, especially, that speaking of social justice recalls us to. Justice is a collective endeavor, but one built on a foundation of individual, personal dignity. As Pope John Paul II said, social justice rests on the threefold cornerstone of human dignity, solidarity, and subsidiarity. The purpose of justice, according to Aquinas, is to direct man in his relations with others. Aquinas follows Cicero, who said of justice that it is the crowning glory of the virtues and the basis upon which men are called good men. Justice, in short, is the basis of our social existence and our ability to live in common. So fundamental was this relationship, writes Augustine, that where there is not true justice, there can be no assemblage of men associated by a common acknowledgement of right, and therefore can be no people. And if no people, then no good of the people, but only of some promiscuous multitude unworthy of the name of people. Indeed, without justice, the state itself is nothing but a great collective act of robbery, says Augustine. The state rules simply because it has power and appropriates from its subjects whatever it requires for its survival. And not only states, but any level of organization can be thought of in these terms. Where justice is lacking, an institution ceases to be truly rational or cohesive body, instead becoming ruled by mere collective self-interest, such as we find with Augustine's band of robbers. The idea of a specifically social justice emerges in the 19th century amongst Catholic thinkers, not because it is a new idea, but in order to assert this traditional vision of justice against modern rivals. Following Machiavelli and Grotius, justice in this time was increasingly being defined reductively in terms of collective self-interest. Liberal materialists, like Herbert Spencer, argued that stark economic inequality was the outcome of Darwinian natural selection. According to Spencer, the poverty of the incapable, the distresses that come upon the imprudent, the starvation of the idle, and those shoulderings aside of the weak by the strong, which leave so many in shallows and in miseries, are the decrees of a large, far-seeing benevolence. Instead of social justice, we have a vision of pitiless social Darwinism. But standing at the opposite end of the political spectrum at this time was a vision of history no less rooted in self-interested struggle and violence. As Marx and Engels write in the Communist Manifesto, freeman and slave, plebeian and patrician, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carrying on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary constitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. And mediating these extremes into our present era, but on a no less materialist basis, stands John Rawls. Like Kant's attempt to reconcile rationalism and empiricism, Rawls performs the crucial synthesis of liberty and equality for modern political thought. Yet this synthesis is one that will decisively exclude the classical vision of virtue and ultimately prove, I believe, dangerously unstable. First of all, Rawls denies the idea of a res publica, a society bound by the common good, in the context of pluralist political reality. He writes, "I believe that a democratic society is not and cannot be a community, whereby a community I mean a body of persons united in affirming the same comprehensive or partially comprehensive doctrine." Rawls also rejects the simple notion of justice as giving each man his due. He defines justice, instead, as a fair system of cooperation between free and equal persons. We notice a number of things about this right away. Justice is not an individual virtue governing individual relationships, but a system. It aims at practical cooperation, rather than any explicitly ethical goal. Finally, it pertains only to free and equal persons, meaning that justice is not directly applicable to relationships between social inferiors and superiors, adults and children, or humans and animals, to name but a few, and has little to say about societies outside of modern liberal democracies with universal suffrage. For Rawls, these elements are necessary because justice is a kind of agreement. It does not have any inherent basis outside of what we collectively sign up to. And so, only those who are competent to consent without any bias or disadvantage can do so fully. In order to transmute our self-interest into a just system, Rawls conceives of something called the original position. This means Most simply, that fairness is defined as whatever social contract we would all agree to if we didn't know our sex, race, class, or social position, all of which is hidden behind a veil of ignorance. Rawls' theory of justice is, I believe, an inhuman one. Justice becomes a mere convention, a system of rules imposed by the coercive state, notionally for our benefit, can be applied between individuals, but only in the sense that game theory, in which each actor is assumed to be rational and self-interested, can be applied to individuals. Honour, compassion, and mercy play no part in it. Rawls' assumption that the common object of a community must be some doctrine or dogma reflects the age of ideological modern states in which he lived, and repeats Popper's error of confusing Plato's political vision in the Republic with totalitarianism. Classical political theory, and even Christian political theory, did not envisage a common set of beliefs as the sole or only basis of social unity, but rather gave primacy to the idea of a common good. But in a Rawlsian system of justice, there is no driving impulse to do the right thing in itself, collective or individual. There is simply the self-interested calculation placed behind the veil of ignorance. The veil is highly important, because though it seems, at first glance, as nothing but a thought experiment, it is actually a way of expressing an all too real mechanism in liberal societies. Essentially, if something in modern life seems unfair, our solution is, inevitably, to make it automated, abstract, and impersonal. I don't know if anyone has ever participated in a blind hiring process, which is now common in most large British institutions. Essentially, CVs are stripped of their personal information. You don't know the person's race, sex, class, or background. You may not even know where they went to school or where they worked. This is intended to prevent unconscious bias and increase diversity in hiring. It's had mixed results to that end, but the more interesting aspect for us is the very fact that blindness is so readily assumed to be a source of justice. In some sense, the idea is a very old one. The Roman goddess Justitia is depicted with a blindfold and stands in many a courtroom in this guise. Aquinas agrees. Respect of persons is opposed to a distributive justice, he writes. He goes on to outline what this means. If you promote a man to a professorship on account of his having sufficient knowledge, you consider the due cause, not the person. But if, in conferring something on someone, you consider in him not the fact that what you give him is proportionate or due to him, but the fact that he is that particular man, then there is respect of the person, that you have given him something not for some cause that renders him worthy of it, but simply because he is this person. However, there is a subtle but important difference here. Justice is a habit and a virtue for Aquinas and is exercised by a judge. The judge does not merely abide by a system of justice, he embodies and practices justice. His blindness is a learned habit of attentiveness to our relevant merits, such that, for example, he judges a person by their character rather than their social class or accent. But if we outsource this habit of justice to an administrative process, what lesson is learnt? What habit is formed? If we follow Rawls, who assigns self-interest, however enlightened, as the basis of his system of fairness, it seems we teach people selfishness and irresponsibility. Justice becomes a matter of abiding by the rules of the system, whilst pursuing our own interests, not a duty that falls on the shoulder of every citizen. In rejecting natural law and rendering justice purely as the working of a social contract, Rawls not only excludes the idea of justice as a virtue, he places force and coercion as the central mechanism of justice. In contrast to this, Aquinas argues that the written law does indeed contain natural right, but it does not establish it, for the latter derives its force not from the law but from nature, whereas the written law both contains positive right and establishes it by giving it force of authority. Note the word used here, authority. When Justice speaks elsewhere of justice as a concept commanding and prescribing what is just, he refers to imperium, the absolute life and death power of a commander on the battlefield in classical political theory, communicating for Aquinas the absolute power of truth and the role of justice within the soul. Yet when he speaks of the law, he does so instead in terms of auctoritas, which is the consensual power of persuasion and prestige within the context of Republican debate, rather than the unilateral might of imperium. The distinction is of supreme importance for understanding the gulf between traditional and modern accounts of the state. Following Hobbes, Rawls sees the state as sheerly coercive, and he assigns justice entirely to how we employ this power. Meanwhile, if we follow Aquinas, we find a definition of law as a teacher and persuader of its subjects. Contrary to the absolutism of coercive power in modern social Darwinism, socialism, and social contract theory, Catholic social teaching has a certain streak of anarchism. Just as unjust societies are no society at all, positive laws that contradict natural laws are, writes Aquinas, not laws, but rather corruptions of laws. Even when positive law is generally valid, where its application would be contrary to natural law, it should be judged not according to the letter of the law, but according to equity, which the lawgiver has in view. Thus, human judgment and a pre-political natural law are both superior to legal positivism within the Thomist tradition, giving priority to rational politics over the dead hand of the state or market. In contrast, Rawls imagined a very limited sphere for the political, which he thought of as excluding transcendent values in the name of pluralism, leaving individuals and communities to pursue their ideas freely through voluntary association. But the very rules of the game that he defined create immediate difficulties and contradictions. The human desire to live in community is inherent, and very quickly it has become evident that liberal societies, which, in Rawlsian fashion, reject the common good, end up raising up liberalism itself as a governing communal doctrine. All the fervour of cancel culture, progressivism, and diversity politics look, from this perspective, like a sublimated desire for the far thicker notion of collective belonging and shared justice. Far more than just neglect to human desires, Rawls's vision actually militates towards such activity over time, by the force of its own logic. If fairness is only possible between free and equal citizens, and the presence of inequality or hierarchy, even when produced by the action of free thought and association, becomes an increasing threat to the legitimacy of the state itself. To fulfill the social contract, ever greater intrusions into our liberty can be countenanced in the name of opposing injustice. Equality laws are passed, and private bodies are deputized as auxiliaries of the coercive state by the mechanism of corporate compliance. Instead of justice, we are subjected to an inhuman system of fairness. A human justice, a social justice, can never be subcontracted, never outsourced. It is only realizable between human persons, acting in solidarity. Through social justice, we are, in the words of Dr. King, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Unlike Rawls's vision of justice, it is an endeavour that must be built block by individuals, pursuing and practicing virtue. It is built not on private self-interest, but on shared sentiments, shared loves, and shared tears. Thank you.
Right. Can everyone hear? Okay. Good morning. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you. Some of you may know that in addition to being a professor at UVA, I'm also very involved in the work of classical Christian education. What I endeavor to bring to classical education is an understanding of the diverse strands of the tradition, stretching from the cultural crossroads of the ancient world to the writings of many biblically formed, classically educated Black intellectuals active from the time of the American founding through today. In that work, as well as in today's talk, I propose that we value diversity because the ability to see from different perspectives greatly enriches and deepens our moral imagination. And it is a well-formed moral imagination which helps us to properly apprehend the truth, goodness, and beauty which may be discernible in the world, and yet obscured due to our limited sight. The moral imagination is that distinctive capacity we have of making pictures or images of the good life and then coming to resemble those pictures. The pictures we make are visions that represent our deepest beliefs and desires related to strongly held convictions about the essential goodness, tragedy, or ambivalence of the world and our place in it. It is the moral imagination which inspires us to ask questions, like what kind of story am I a part of in this community or country? Are there enemies and friends in this story? Or, in the parlance of our current societal struggles, are there victims and oppressors? And if so, which am I? And how do I overcome the other? The way we answer these questions is crucial, not only for our individual lives, but for our life in common. Russell Kirk describes the fruit of a well-formed moral imagination as that within us which, quote, aspires to the apprehending of right order in the soul and right order in the commonwealth, end quote. We can readily see how the moral imagination shapes this connection between self and society when we give further consideration to the question, are there enemies and friends in this story I'm a part of, and how do I relate to them? In his work during the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King Jr., though looking out at an incredibly hostile, dangerous, violently white supremacist world, encouraged his partners in struggle to think not simply in terms of enemies and friends, but in terms of transforming enemies into friends. This counterintuitive way of envisioning the world, of casting a vision of hope where most would see only despair, was born of King's quite robust, carefully formed moral imagination. This imagination emerged from his deep study of the scriptures, his experience of the Black church, and his immersion in classic and canonical readings from ancient Israel, readings of philosophy, literature, and the social sciences. He drew on wisdom traditions ranging from ancient Israel and Greece to 20th century India. He learned from and imitated great models across time that included Socrates' struggle for justice, Paul's sufferings on behalf of the gospel, and his own parents' faithful lives in the Black Baptist church of his youth. As he studied and read, King engaged in what he described as dialogical reading, sifting the ideas of the readings through the sieve of his faith to determine what he should keep and what he must allow to slip through into the dirt of the world. It was this process, drawing on these rich sources, that allowed King and many others in his community to develop the kind of moral imagination that propelled them to fight for justice while drawing the entire national community toward a vision for greater flourishing. It was, undoubtedly, a time of great polarization, but also a time of great vision led largely by the African American community. The United States of the 1960s and 1970s was characterized by polarization along lines of race that were very clearly demarcated, enshrined in the law as well as the built environment. Today, as we look out at the political landscape, it is clear that we continue to be polarized, but in new, more concerning ways. In Talking to Strangers, Danielle Allen notes the lingering of racial distrust 50 years post-Brown v. Board of Education. And this despite the fact that for most Americans living today, interracial distrust now is a product more of retrospective than of immediate personal experience and prevails along fossilized boundaries of difference. In his new book, Democracy and Solidarity, James Hunter traces the precipitous decline over the last century of those cultural sources for solidarity or cohesion that, by virtue of their opacity, could contain democracy's many internal disagreements. His argument is not that our differences are somehow more intense, for we have always been deeply divided on key issues, but rather that the cultural sources, like those that shaped King's moral imagination, have diminished in our shared life, leaving behind dissension in the face of declining resources for cultivating solidarity. In American Covenant, Phil Gorski describes this predicament as a decline of the political center, though he's careful to say that this center is no squishy third way. Instead, he describes this center as a living tradition that is animated by, quote, a political vocabulary that enables dialogue and debate between left and right. Adherents of this center are dedicated to a common vision of the American project that is grounded in America's civil religious tradition. It is this declining common vision of the American project and the cultural resources needed to bolster that vision that I want to focus on today. As a historical sociologist, I take note that so many of our cultural and political struggles of late have revolved around contentious quarrels over American history. These history struggles are so intense precisely because what is at stake is our competing understandings of what it means to be American. In short succession, we've had the 1619 versus 1776 debate, the call for the removal of Confederate monuments, the blow-up over AP African American Studies curriculum, a precipitous rise in library book challenges and bans across the country, and struggles over CRT and DEI with bannings of each. These struggles tend to conform to two dominant modes of interpreting the country's past. One, a nefarious origins lens, and two, the triumph of ideals. The nefarious origins mode utilizes a dark lens that emphasizes the nefarious character of the American founding and the subsequent line of injustices flowing out of it. The triumph of ideals emphasizes the strength of founding ideals and minimizes the ravages wrought upon Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and others marginalized from the beginning. To be clear, the triumphalist approach does not deny these dark chapters, but it does tend to greatly minimize them. Much of our public debate cycles back and forth across these two poles. But there is a third position coming out of the Black intellectual tradition, which I think is best described as the integrative blues. The integrative blues stance holds in creative tension the critique at the heart of the nefarious origin story and the stirring vision of the triumph of ideals. Writers and activists of the Black intellectual tradition, including Phyllis Wheatley, David Walker, Frederick Douglass, Anna Julia Cooper, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, and artists and musicians like Henry Osawa Tanner, Bessie Smith, Mahalia Jackson, Jacob Lawrence, and Romare Bearden, have sustained this integrative blues stance by engaging in imaginative re-envisioning that simultaneously laments injustice, reaffirms our highest ideals, and points the country toward new, life-giving ways of being and living well together. These three modes of making sense of the American past, nefarious origins, triumph of ideals, and integrative blues, are best understood as ideal types in the Weberian sense. That is to say, few people will be wholly characterized by just one of these positions, and the edges of one mode shade over into the next, but they are very useful to think with. Rather than fitting snugly into one of these three positions, we typically move back and forth along the spectrum according to a shifting politics of desire for justice and peace, for reckoning and reconciliation. Where we dwell longest or most intently depends to no small extent on our particular moral imagination of how the world is and should be, and of how we believe people like us would best flourish within it. But while most people will exist somewhere in between, moving back and forth among the three modes, we do tend to consistently gravitate more toward one mode, desire, and stance than another. To summarize, here is a breakdown of the kind of story each mode envisions when considering American history. Mode 1, nefarious origins. The story I am part of is innately dark, violent, unjust, and requires foundational transformation. The politics of desire here are for justice or vengeance, and the political stance is to strongly critique and reject the dominant project and to create a new vision that is more just. Mode 2, the integrative blues. The story I am part of is dark, but elements of goodness are there as well, and it's possible to engage the darkness while working to shine light on and expand the goodness that has been obscured. The politics of desire here for overcoming and transcendence. The political stance, critique the worst of the current project and work with others to co-create a revised version that cultivates the best of the original project while envisioning a future beyond that project's blinders and limitations. Mode 3, resilient and triumphant. The story I am part of is fundamentally good, even if there may be a few bad actors now and then. Focusing on those bad actors obscures the goodness that characterizes most of the story. The politics of desire here are for stability and peace, and the political stance is to promote assimilation to the mainstream dominant project largely as it is. Because the first and third positions are most prominently on display in much of our public discourse, I'll focus here on highlighting what is distinctive about the integrative blues position. For general descriptions, I have found James Cone and Cornel West to be most eloquent. Now, I'm aware that they are at the more progressive of the Christian theology end than the more conservative. And most conservative Christians would not readily embrace their theologies. But one need not accept liberal theology in order to accept the excellence of their descriptions of this blues position. Cohn describes it in his wonderful book, The Spirituals and the Blues, this way. Black music is unity music. It unites the joy and the sorrow, the love and the hate, the hope and the despair of Black people, and it moves the people toward the direction of total liberation. I have affirmed the reality of the spirituals and blues as authentic expressions of my humanity, responding to them in the rhythms of dance. I therefore write about the spirituals and the blues because I am the blues, and my life is a spiritual. Without them, I cannot be. West describes himself as a bluesman in the life of the mind, and in this passage from his memoir provides an evocative description of what this means. The bluesmen sing of real life, here and now experiences of tragedy and comedy, even as they offer up help. They offer up strategies for survival. They share their coping skills. They get us to dancing and laughing, rapping, and exposing the hypocrisy of a soulless and sanitized civilization. Bluesmen aren't sanitized. Bluesmen aren't deodorized. Bluesmen are funky. Bluesmen got soul. The great blues artists Toni Morrison, Louis Armstrong, B.B. King, Sterling Brown, Marvin Gaye, Aretha Franklin, Lil Wayne, Alvin Ailey, Curtis Mayfield, Gwendolyn Brooks, Bob Dylan, Thomas Hardy, Bob Marley, Ella Fitzgerald, August Wilson fight the good fight by doing what they can and moving on. But what does it mean to be a bluesman in the life of the mind? Like my fellow musicians, I've got to forge a unique style and voice that expresses my own quest for truth and love. That means following the quest wherever it leads and bearing whatever cost is required. So that is West on being a bluesman in the life of the mind. I want to say more now about what this integrative blues position looks like in practice at home, on the streets, in our communities. How does understanding it provide guidance for our efforts to work across lines of seemingly ingrained difference? I identify three distinctives. One, it is a tradition of critique characterized by a kind of alchemy that transforms suffering via creative work into a hope-filled re-envisioning from what is now into what can yet be. We see this alchemy present in blues music itself, in spirituals, in much of the story and literature of Black writers. This is a tradition that knows the power of beauty for working through and overcoming tribulation. Two, a dedication to justice that recognizes that our lives are governed according to two different logics of time, chronos and kairos. We struggle for justice and freedom now, desiring it to come quickly, while recognizing that even if it is long in coming, the God of all justice is with us. He sees all and judges all, acting for our good. What may be defeats or disappointments now may nevertheless be filled with meaning and significance that transcends our immediate political struggles. This orientation to time matters greatly, because if all we have is chronos, that significantly raises the stakes of winning now at just about any cost, including the violent annihilation of our enemies. And three, when it comes to those who actively work against us or those who simply fail to support what is right, we seek to persuade by sowing seeds of truth and inviting them to friendship rather than enmity. This was the approach even of David Walker, the fiery writer who in his 1829 appealed to the colored people of the world and treated white Christians to repent and live out true Christian brotherhood with Black people. If they failed to do so, he pointed out that they would fall under God's judgment as well as the likelihood of violent slave revolt. But he sought first to sow the seeds of comity. Some of that seed fell on stony ground and never took root. Some into shallow soil that flowered briefly before being burnt up by the sun, and some into fertile ground, taking root in those who joined the abolitionist cause. This integrative blues tradition is under considerable pressure with a younger generation less knowledgeable about it, and where there is knowledge, less inclined to embrace it. But despite the pressures under which this integrative blues tradition labors, within the context of the US today, it represents one of the strongest and longest lasting instantiations of the civil religion Bella emphasized, the political center Gorski entreats us to cultivate in American Covenant, and the imaginaries of hope that Hunter calls us toward in the closing pages of Democracy and Solidarity. There are still today communities, churches, and people whose lives testify to the strength and creative power of this integrative blues tradition. The incarnational experience of the tradition is crucial because the moral imagination that births this kind of practice must be gleaned from more than reading about the tradition. It must be lived out and passed on. It is my hope that more young people at the primary, secondary, and university levels will learn and borrow liberally from the integrative blues position modeled in the Black church and Black intellectual tradition. Thank you.
My thanks to all three of you. We have about 20 minutes for questions. We have microphones, which I would ask you to use so that we can get it on the record. Otherwise, your question won't be picked up. And I would also ask, this is fairly common at conferences like this, for the chair to remind you to please ask a question when you are asking a question. But before we go to the audience, I would invite the panelists if you have comments or questions for each other.
So I guess I had a comment/question for you, Sebastian. So the example that you gave from, was it Hard Times?
Bleak House.
Bleak House, from Bleak House, was a really good one. And I think that sense of, kind of this rigid moralizing where there might not on the surface of it be a problem if you're just looking at the wording, but the lack of humanity is so important, and the compassion is absolutely necessary. I guess one of the questions that arose from me thinking that through was, I certainly embrace that in terms of the compassion and kind of the individual relationship. But I wonder what you would say about the need sometimes for systemic change. And so I'm thinking, there have been many contexts in the U.S. as well as in other places where that one-to-one or small community compassion is very important, but that there are areas of suffering that have to be addressed at a larger level. And I wonder how you would respond to that.
Well, first of all, I completely agree that justice is something that has to happen at a larger level. In fact, there is no justice unless it happens on a large scale. But I think I would say there's a difference between a change that is merely imposed superficially. So I've passed a law, I've solved the problem. And I think real change has to happen at the level of the human heart. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't pass a law, that you shouldn't pass a law. But I think that we need to understand that to pursue justice collectively, it means something more like a fundamental change of kind rather than merely an expression of power that reinforces an existing power structure. So, I think the example of corporations, I'd say the difference is I'm going to get the HR team to impose something on our employees so they act the way we think they should, and between the difference between the idea of corporations themselves having a defined social purpose, so that rather than just being accountable to their shareholders, they're accountable to society more widely, to the customers who use it, to their workers. Things like employee democracy, for example, is a good example of how that can be done.
Thank you.
Charlie, I wanted to follow up on your last comment, where you mentioned that some of the smaller, less prestigious perhaps, less financially successful Catholic colleges have a view of the common good or a view of their good, which you find to be more successful. Could you explain how you think that might translate from those colleges to the larger, more prestigious, more financially successful places?
Well, I think they illustrate, because there's high level, despite some of the critiques of these places, there is high level work being done at these places. And in fact, some of the best work is being done at these places. And so I think you have to choose between having a deep and profound commitment to your institutional mission and identity and unity, and being really important players in the sphere of research is just a false one. So these better endowed, more established, more legacy type institutions don't in fact have to choose between being high level players, high level research players, and having foundational commitments to their mission and identity and a commitment to unity.
Good. Brandon, are you running the microphone for us, or do we have someone? Let's go to questions. So questions, please. We invite your comments and questions.
When you're trying to have intellectual discussions with quote-unquote opponents, you often get stymied because when you get into the nitty-gritty on a very diplomatic level, it seems to stop. And I'll bring up the issue of the unborn. Despite total non-theological arguments, just based on science and the textbooks before 1973 say it's a separate human person, the other side, from my experience, doesn't want to talk about that. You just, they'll go into euphemisms and so forth. So how do you push the argument forward with recognizing the other person's human dignity? How do you do this? I'm constantly stymied when I try this.
That's obviously a huge question, and it's one which I have written a book. So it's cheating to say read my book, but read my book. But I will say very briefly for our current moment, I think one thing that I've seen really be helpful here in the interest of finding common ground, a starting point to have conversation, is the pain of miscarriage and pregnancy loss. This is something that is, especially as fertility rates have gone down and the frustration associated with trying to get pregnant has gone up in many contexts. The pain of losing a pregnancy is so profound and transcends the abortion question. But it doesn't really transcend it, because what it does is it sort of honors this reality here outside of the context of the abortion debate. And there's so much more I could say about this, but that's just one thing that came to mind is if we can honor the pain of people who've lost babies prenatally, and that is something that can transcend the abortion debate, that does offer us footing, I think, to move in other directions.
Angel, I wonder if you could address that as well with the category of chaotic time. So we're aware that some debates feel intractable. Alistair McIntyre says that most of the moral debates are now interminable, that they have no directionality to them. How might the idea of kairos play a role in our own experience of the intractability of some disagreements?
That's a really good and very difficult question. And I suppose it depends on what the issue is, right? So if it's an issue that feels like we are, our existence is, our very existence or life is at risk, we respond one way. If we think it's a matter of different preferences, we respond differently. So it's a little difficult to say in the abstract. But I would say, I think this gets at part of what I concluded with on that section, which is that if we understand ourselves to only be operating ever in chronos, I think it makes it very hard for us to have a kind of any generosity of spirit or, kind of take a breath and think through and listen carefully and operate in love. So I think the very idea of understanding that we also live in kairos time means that even if we are, kind of up against the wall, as it may be, that in some cases it may be better to suffer than to use means for transformation that are going to presage a violent kind of end. And so here's where I think of King often talked about means and ends, and the fact that we can't only think in terms of the ends because the means are going to predetermine what those ends are going to be like, right? So we could say, we want a more just society, so we're just going to violently overthrow, the government and get our justice. But then by the very, fact that you did that, now what you're going to end up is going to be something horrifying, essentially. And so in that case, rather than the violent overthrow, one may actually need to take a step back and endure some suffering. And so it's not a very comfortable answer. And it's not the kind of answer where I would say, yeah, you just have to be ready to roll over and suffer, because that's not it either. You know, I think it's really something where one has to exercise practical wisdom. It's not always going to be clear in a particular context how to do that. But just the fact of knowing that one operates in Kairos time completely changes, I think, our understanding of many different situations.
Other questions?
Sam Wells from London. This one's for Sebastian. You gave a pretty good pasting to justice by acronym. But my question is really about scale. From memory, the labour movement in the UK really arose at the point when the factory owners no longer knew the names of all the people in their factories. Let's say the transition from the 1840s to the 1890s. And the second generation, third generation factory owners who didn't have the relationship that the first generation factory founders had. And I've experienced the same thing in my own organisation at St Martin in the Fields in London, where when I came, we probably had about 180 staff. Now we have about 300, and I don't know everybody's name anymore. So a paternalistic approach by which we used to not have a whole bunch of policies, but we used to know who had cancer and who was struggling and needed a bit of help beyond the statutory sick pay. We used to be able to help people out. Now we do need all the policies because it's just too big. And I wonder if there's a strand in what you're describing that, to use perhaps an edgy word, has a bit of nostalgia for the days when that kind of relational understanding of justice would work. But now, probably for both of us, coming to this side of the Atlantic, which is just so big, that it's beyond anybody to achieve that kind of relational paternalism. I know paternalism is always a bad word, but in some context it can be better than the alternative. But it's just not possible on the kind of scale that we're talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, it may sound sentimental, but actually I think something like the opposite is true. That I think there was a huge amount of faith in the post-war period in large organizations and economies of scale to deliver justice. But we've discovered the opposite. Since the 1970s, large organizations and globalization have delivered ever greater inequality. They've delivered ever more instability. We're seeing, for example, inflation, cost of living increases, an incredible vulnerability to global conflict because of our interconnectedness. Now, that's not to say that every economy of scale is bad, but I think that, in fact, the next wave of organizational revolution may look much more like a radical decentralization, may look much more like small teams working autonomously. And in fact, it may be that technology is making that easier. The improvements in communications, the ability to manufacture things on a smaller scale without the same costs, all of these things may become more possible.
Brandon, can we go to Eric Gregory over here, please?
Thanks so much. I think maybe this is an invitation for a dialogue between the last two speakers, because I was struck in the way Sebastian presented the sort of Rawlsian alternative and the Thomistic one, which actually mirrored a debate we just had in our faculty here about whether the university here should be committed to neutrality in the name of pluralism, or if we're a moral institution with some notion of the common good or shared social justice. So it does relate to the university. But my question is maybe whether or not the vision that was presented about the black, let's call it the black liberal tradition, evades the criticisms you had, Sebastian, of the Rawlsian presentation, or whether it still sounds a little too much civil religion, too much kind of liberalism, that there's still a confrontation between that and Christianity. Because it does seem, the way it was presented, it's a modern virtue tradition that tries to hold together, the darkness and the hope, the sense of virtue and the common good, even as it is committed to an aspirational liberal democratic project. And it wasn't clear where that would fit in your criticism of liberalism to court.
So it's a very good question indeed. I don't think it was a coincidence that I quoted Dr. King, because I think the transformations of that period were built on precisely, the actual communities able to organize in a way that probably they wouldn't be able to do today. That we've lost a lot of that kind of Republican, not just in America but in England as well, those sort of Republican ties, a thing that the Romans called the vinculum, the civic bond. I think part of one of the tragedies of liberalism is that it has historically relied on a virtue that it's not always able to sustain. So that liberal systems work best when they can appeal to things that are beyond liberalism. So that Rawls imagined this whole world of voluntary association that would embody all of those classical virtues in a consensual way. But I think by so unmooring the two, so unmooring virtue from statecraft, he set them on an inevitable collision course.
I would also say, I think that's true that liberalism doesn't always understand the cultural and normative foundations on which it relies, right? And so I think what you do see in the Black intellectual tradition that I was talking about here is that it's very much, for much of American history, of course, that is changing some now, but for the vast majority of the time, it's been very much focused on faith and rooted in faith, and not something that you could really separate from that. And that's why you do get what you get in the civil rights movement. And I think, some incarnations of liberalism, like Rawls's, you kind of leech the thing of everything, and you get, in the name of getting this, objective view. But you really can't. But it's never really is objective, because there has to be something coherent underlying it, that people are, even, the rules are not perhaps spelled out, but they're really there. And I think we're getting to a point where we're seeing that fabric is unraveling, and now it's becoming even more troublesome than it had been before.
Thank you all, that was really interesting. And Angel, I particularly loved the blues analogy. And it had me thinking about music. And I actually think that music, and specifically the idea of harmony, is a very helpful way of thinking about diversity, and is quite closely related to Plato's idea of justice as this kind of diversity, sort of many different people with different functions, all flourishing in some way that's unified. But actually what's really crucial to that kind of harmonious model of diversity is it really is an emphasis on difference, and the contrast and even potentially conflict between different parts, which sounds kind of paradoxical, but if you think about Plato, and obviously his sort of cosmology is really in the mirror of his idea of justice, so I do think this is relevant. But you know how in the Timaeus, where he talks about sort of the beginning of the universe, you have all these different elements of fire, earth, air, and water. They're actually existing in this state of kind of tension and contrast. It's this idea that's sometimes known as concordia discourse, like a kind of harmony in discord. The reason I say all of that is not just to be florid, but because I think there is merit in this idea of diversity as something that crucially does not erase difference. You have the individuality of each part that's complementary in some ways, but in a way actually really kind of in conflict sometimes. So I'm just sort of thinking about how in modern diversity, I think you actually, in trying to impose a kind of unity, you end up with a kind of sameness. Whereas I think in this more harmonic paradigm, it's really a way of empowering difference. And I suppose maybe it's potentially quite a difficult question. It's sort of for all of you really, sort of how do we understand sort of diversity as something that really does rest on difference and potentially even conflict, without compromising our sense of absolute truth and the ultimate unity? How do you kind of have those two things at the same time that neither flattens difference and ends up with an artificial unity, but also, obviously we don't want chaos either. We're not relativists here. Difference has to be tempered by something. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's really good. And thinking in terms of harmony can be useful, I think, in some ways. I think in terms of the conflict, so I think harmony is one kind of metaphor we can use. I think another is more in terms of lenses of seeing the world and, areas where we may have blind spots that we need others to help us to see, and that's another way that diversity is actually very crucial. But I think in both of those, what can be useful here is I would draw on more of a Socratic dialectic. That is, that there's an idea that we might not quite, maybe I don't quite have it and you don't quite have it, but we keep asking the questions, we keep working toward. So in other words, we're not just kind of coming from these various positions just to represent various positions, but the idea is that we are working toward something that is true. And there's a sense of when we are getting further away from the truth or closer to that truth. But you do need to have that kind of dialectic, and that I think there's a way in which these different views, the analogy doesn't work so well for harmony as it does maybe in terms of a visual metaphor of lenses or different kinds of sight that we may have. I can see one part of it, you can see another part of it, and then that helps us, in kind of reaching toward something. But I think there does have to be some kind of agreement that may be a kind of faith that there are better answers, or there is something closer to what is good or right. And in our current circumstance, there seems to be a kind of all-out attack on the idea that there might actually be something good or right that we could grope toward. So it does require at least that foundational agreement.
Go to Akil here in the front, please.
So when asking the question, why do we value diversity, I kind of go at a meta level, saying and working from the premise that humanity's goal is to evolve to its full potential. And for evolution, you need diversity and natural selection. And I was wondering, is that framework, anyone of you have thought about diversity and natural selection important for our evolution? And it can work at every level of our society, whether it's a school or college, or we evolve differently, but for any evolution, we need diversity and natural selection. Or is that a hindrance towards our potential? Just a thought.
Anyone in particular? Brandon mentioned earlier Aquinas asking the question about why is the universe not just the same? Why is there so much difference in the universe? And one of Aquinas' arguments is we would not be able to have any understanding at all, and we really still don't understand the infinity of God if there wasn't just the sheer amount of difference and plurality in the universe. So we have so many different species, we have so many differences of types. Now, not only does that allow us to have some sense or inclination of the infinite unity of God, but of course the difference is productive just for the integrity and autonomy of the world itself. If you think about how emergent probability works, if we didn't have difference on the subatomic level, we would never get to the atomic level, and we need difference on the atomic level so we can get to the organic level. And if we didn't have difference in the organic level, we couldn't have reproduction. Right? So it's quite obvious that the plurality that we see just present in nature not only is necessary for evolution and for the success and survival, but it makes sense then when we're trying to understand the formation of schools and so on. So in my mind, it's very good that we have varieties of schools, large schools, small schools, religious schools, and so on, because the frisson of that, in fact, allows for productivity in the search for truth, technology, and so on. And in the end, it gives us a better image of the unity of God than we would have had otherwise.
Thank you. I'm Adam Idle. I teach at the University of Dallas. That's one of those poor but wildly successful Catholic schools you're talking about. I was intrigued by Dr. Parham's typology of founding narratives, and especially the one that says that we're swimming downstream of a moment of original violence, and then it has a conception of the problems in front of us and certain solutions. And critics of DEI might say that the founding narrative, or at least the more radical versions of DEI, have a kind of founding narrative that would fall under that first type. But my question's for, I think it's for Dr. Milbank, but I invite a response from the rest of the panel. I was wondering whether you would also say that your description of the liberal regime also is one, it's a founding narrative or myth of original violence. You know, those social contracts, they're a bit of a boondoggle, and the veil looks nice, but you've been hoodwinked.
No, well, I mean, I thought Dr. Parham's image was very evocative too. I thought this idea of every conflict becomes existential, and the sense which liberal political theory of the Hobbesian variety is a bit of a loaded gun. Because if there is a single state monopoly of violence, if there is a single coercive authority, and that is the state, then every political battle becomes existential. It becomes a battle for total power over your opponent. So I think that's a very good point.
Good. Thank you to the three of you for your contributions.